It was supposed to be a routine operation. Just another mission, another day. But somehow, everything about it felt wrong from the start. I could sense the tension in the air, a sort of heaviness that didn't belong. I'd been part of this unit for 3 years, and I knew these people well. When something didn't feel right, it usually wasn't. We were sitting in the briefing room, listening to the commander outline the mission. The details were vague, just like they always were. But this time, there was an edge to the commander's voice, something uncertain in his words that caught my attention. I glanced around at the faces of my comrades. Some were nervous, others confused, and a few had that familiar look of bravado that soldiers often wear to hide their true feelings. "Any questions?" the commander asked, his eyes scanning the room. No one spoke. No one ever spoke when it came to these kinds of missions. We just followed orders, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being sent into something much bigger than we were prepared for. The mission was supposed to be simple: infiltrate an enemy stronghold, gather intel, and get out. But as the briefing continued, I began to realize how wrong it all sounded. This wasn't just a routine operation. We were walking into the heart of enemy territory, deep behind their lines. No backup, no extraction plan, just us. And then there was the mission leader, Sergeant Blake. A man who had always seemed unshakable, the kind of leader who inspired respect with his quiet strength. But even he looked troubled, his jaw clenched as if he was trying to suppress his own doubts. I couldn't help but feel a deep unease. Something about this mission didn't add up. I wasn't the only one who noticed. I could see the tension on the faces of the other soldiers too. But none of us spoke up. We were trained to trust our superiors, to follow orders, no matter how dangerous they seemed. The mission was set for tomorrow morning. And I, like everyone else, prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging mission we had ever faced. But what none of us knew was that this mission would change everything. Forever. The next morning, when the sun barely touched the horizon, we loaded into the helicopters, our gear heavy with the weight of what was ahead. No one said a word. We all just looked out the windows, lost in our thoughts, bracing for what was to come. But it wasn't just fear I felt. I felt something else, something deeper. A sense of dread that seemed to settle deep in my bones. The chopper ride was a blur, the roar of the engines drowning out everything else. My thoughts raced as we neared the drop zone. This wasn't like anything we had done before. The enemy base wasn't some isolated outpost. It was a fortified compound, surrounded by thick woods and guarded by more men than we could count. And here we were, fewer than 20 of us, facing what could easily be over 100. As we touched down, the noise from the blades slicing through the air was deafening, but everything around us was oddly quiet. The tension was thick, each of us feeling the weight of what was to come. We quickly disembarked, moving in formation, trying to stay as silent as possible. I could hear the rapid thumping of my heart, the steady rhythm of boots against dirt, and the low, controlled breathing of my teammates. But it wasn't long before the silence shattered. A gunshot echoed through the trees, and everything went into chaos. The air was thick with tension as the enemy fired from all directions. My training kicked in, and instinctively, I dropped to the ground, pulling my rifle close, trying to make sense of the confusion around me. The radio buzzed with frantic orders from Sergeant Blake, but it was already clear. This wasn't a controlled operation anymore. We were in the middle of an ambush. I tried to focus, to block out the noise, the gunfire, the chaos. But it was impossible. It was like the world had exploded in front of me, and there was no escaping it. And then I saw him. Private Harris. He had been with us for less than a year, still learning the ropes. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he tried to fire back at the enemy. But his shots were wild, untrained, and panic was setting in. I could see the fear in his eyes, and that's when I realized how bad it had gotten. We weren't just outnumbered. We were outclassed. The enemy had planned for this, and we were walking right into their trap. I turned to Sergeant Blake, who was crouched behind a fallen tree trying to assess the situation. I could see the frustration on his face, the realization that our options were running out. We were stuck in the open, and if we didn't act fast, we wouldn't make it out alive. "Blake, we need to pull back," I called, my voice barely audible over the noise. We can't win this, we're too exposed. He looked at me, his face hard, as if the words didn't register. He didn't want to hear it, but deep down I knew the truth. We weren't going to make it out of here unless we did something drastic. That's when I saw him, the enemy leader. He was standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and in that instant everything changed. It wasn't just a face in the crowd anymore. It was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Someone who had planned this ambush with precision. And as much as it terrified me, I knew that if we didn't get out now, we wouldn't have a chance. The decision was made in an instant. Sergeant Blake, despite his earlier hesitation, locked eyes with me. Without a word, he made the call. "Fall back. Fall back," he shouted, and within moments, we began to retreat. But it wasn't going to be easy. The enemy was closing in fast. As we moved, I kept my eyes on Harris. He was still panicking, still unsure of what to do. I could see it in the way he moved, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. We couldn't afford that kind of hesitation. "Harris," I shouted, grabbing his arm as we ran. "Stay with me. Stay focused." He nodded, his face pale and filled with fear, but I could see that something had clicked. He was starting to get it. But as we made our way through the dense trees, the sound of gunfire never stopped. And just as I thought we might be getting away, the worst thing happened. A shot rang out, closer this time, and then another. Harris collapsed, falling to the ground with a blood-curdling scream. I froze. My heart stopped. Harris, he had been hit. The world seemed to slow as I ran toward him, ignoring the danger around me. But as I knelt beside him, I saw the look in his eyes, the fear, the pain, but also something else. It was like he was asking me for something more than just help. It was like he was begging me to save everyone else. But there was no time. No time for anything except to get him out of there. "Get to the chopper," Blake yelled, his voice distant. I looked at Harris, then back at the rest of the team, who were already retreating further into the woods. We were running out of time. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I looked at Harris, struggling to breathe. The blood was soaking through his uniform, and his eyes were unfocused, glazed with pain. He was fading, and I knew we didn't have much time. "Hold on, Harris. Just stay with me," I whispered, my hands pressed hard against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But it was too much. I could already see the color draining from his face. In that moment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just the adrenaline or the survival instinct that drove me, it was something deeper. Harris, despite everything, was just a kid. He didn't deserve to die like this. None of us did. I glanced up, seeing the others already retreating. Blake was leading them, but I could see the way his face was twisted in indecision. He knew what had to be done, but he didn't want to leave anyone behind. No one ever does. But in war, sometimes you have no choice. The sound of gunfire got closer, and I knew the enemy wasn't far behind. We were in enemy territory, and the longer we stayed, the less likely we were to make it out alive. "Sergeant," I said, standing up and shouting toward Blake, "we can't wait. We need to move now." Blake turned back, his face drawn with the weight of leadership. He saw Harris lying there, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something to hold us together. But then I saw it. He made the decision. The hard decision. "Go," he shouted, his voice thick with command. "We'll cover you." My heart twisted. Blake had already decided. It was the only way we were getting out alive. "I'm not leaving him," I said, kneeling beside Harris again. My voice shook, but my resolve was strong. "We can't just leave him here." Blake's eyes met mine, and for the briefest of moments, I saw the same pain in his eyes that I felt. But there was no time. He knew what had to be done. "You need to go now," Blake said, his voice low but firm. "I'll stay with the others. We'll hold them off." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. We were abandoning Harris, but there was no choice. "I'm sorry," I whispered to Harris, pressing my lips to his forehead. "We're gonna make it out. You hear me? We're going to make it." I stood up, feeling my legs tremble beneath me. I looked at Blake once more, and without another word, I turned and ran. The enemy was closing in, and the last thing I wanted was to be trapped here, knowing that no one would survive. As I ran, I kept my focus ahead, pushing through the pain in my chest, the overwhelming guilt. We left Harris behind. But we had to. It was the only way for the rest of us to make it out. We made it to the extraction point just as the chopper arrived. I could see the others already loaded in, their faces weary but relieved to see the helicopter. But none of us were truly safe yet. I glanced around at the others, my mind still on the decision we had made, the one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. We had left one of our own behind. As the chopper lifted off, the deafening noise of the blades filled the air, and for a moment it was like everything had gone silent. My mind was replaying the mission in slow motion, the screams, the gunfire, the decision. Harris's face. Then I heard it, the voice of our commander over the radio. "We've got a problem. The enemy is moving in fast. We're not out of this yet." I turned to Blake, who was sitting across from me, his face grim. He had that look in his eyes, the one I knew all too well, the one that meant we were far from finished. "We have to go back," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "We can't just leave him like that." Blake looked at me, his expression unreadable, but I knew what he was thinking. The same thing I was thinking. The mission wasn't over, not by a long shot, and whatever we faced next, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something much deeper, something we hadn't realized until now. Respect, honor, and a debt we could never repay. But before I could say anything more, the helicopter jerked violently, throwing us all against the walls. "Hold on," the pilot shouted, his voice frantic. The world around me spun, and for a moment I thought we were going to crash. But then everything went still. The chopper steadied itself, and I looked around, seeing that Blake and the others were still alive. But the shock hadn't worn off, and the thought of what we'd left behind was gnawing at me. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The pilot's voice came back, urgent. "We've been hit. There's a chance we might not make it out of here." The feeling of dread returned, and for a split second, I felt like we were trapped, caught between our past mistakes and an uncertain future. But we weren't out of it yet. There was still one last thing I could do, and it had everything to do with the respect we'd earned from our enemies. The helicopter lurched again, and this time, I could feel the panic spreading through the team. The pilot was trying to keep control, but it was clear this wasn't going to be an easy escape. The enemy had hit us hard, and every second that passed made it less likely we would make it out alive. "Brace for impact," the pilot shouted, his voice filled with urgency. I gripped the seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept thinking about Harris, about what we had left behind. We had made it out, but at what cost? I glanced over at Blake. His jaw was set, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was always the one who led us, the one who carried the weight of every decision. But this time, even he couldn't escape the consequences. The chopper was shaking violently now, and I could hear the engine sputtering. We were losing altitude fast. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to push the thoughts of failure out of my head, but they lingered like ghosts. And then, just as I thought it was over, something unexpected happened. The chopper jerked upright, the sudden movement throwing us all against our seats. We were no longer plummeting toward the ground. I opened my eyes, confused, trying to make sense of what was going on. The pilot's voice broke through the chaos. "We've been intercepted. They're forcing us down. Hold on." I looked out the window and my breath caught in my throat. Through the trees I saw something I hadn't expected. Another helicopter, this one belonging to the enemy, had appeared out of nowhere. They were in pursuit, closing in fast. I could feel my blood run cold. There was no way we could outrun them. The enemy had us trapped, both in the air and on the ground. "Get ready for a hard landing," the pilot yelled, his hands gripping the controls with desperation. We didn't have much time. As the chopper descended, I could see the enemy's soldiers waiting below, their weapons trained on us. It was clear we weren't going to be able to fight our way out. But then, just as the chopper hit the ground with a bone-shattering thud, a miracle happened. Out of the trees came a group of soldiers. Our soldiers. The ones who had stayed behind, the ones we thought we'd lost. They appeared like ghosts, moving swiftly and silently through the woods, their guns drawn and ready. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Blake had done the one thing no one expected. He had gone back, leading a rescue mission of his own. They were here to save us. The enemy didn't see them coming. Our soldiers charged forward with precision, taking down the first wave of attackers before they even had a chance to react. "Move," Blake shouted, pulling me to my feet. We didn't hesitate. We ran toward the cover of the trees, our hearts pounding in our chests. We weren't out of danger yet, but with Blake's team here, we had a fighting chance. But the real shock came when we reached the edge of the forest. In the distance, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows, walking calmly toward us. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the silhouette. It was the enemy leader, the man who had watched us with cold, calculating eyes. But there was something different this time. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't even with his soldiers. He was alone. As he approached, I could see the look in his eyes. He wasn't angry or vengeful. Instead, there was respect. A silent understanding that neither of us had expected. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze locking with mine. For a moment, everything else faded. It was just the two of us standing there, enemies who had fought against each other, but now, for the first time, truly seeing each other. "You could have run," he said quietly, his voice surprisingly calm. "But you didn't." I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "We don't leave our own behind." He nodded, almost as if he understood, though I wasn't sure he did. And then, in a move that shocked me to my core, he did something I never expected. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device. Before I could react, he pressed it into my hand. "It's a beacon," he said, his eyes narrowing. "It will get you out. The extraction point is 2 miles from here." I stared at the device in disbelief. This was the enemy leader, a man who had just moments before been ready to kill us, and now he was helping us? The silence between us stretched, and I knew there was only one thing I could say. "Why?" He gave a half smile. "Sometimes respect doesn't have to come from the battlefield. It comes from the decisions you make." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees before anyone could react. I stood there, holding the beacon in my hand, unsure of what had just happened. The mission, the impossible odds, the decision to turn back, it had all led to this moment. A moment where, somehow, respect had been earned from both sides. Blake was already signaling to the rest of the team, urging them to move toward the extraction point. The helicopter was on its way. As we made our way through the woods, the weight of everything that had happened settled over me. Harris was gone, and we had lost so much. But in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still honor in the world. Even in the face of impossible odds. And in the end, that respect, the kind you earn, not through power or force, but through the choices you make, was what truly mattered. Hey there, I hope you enjoyed this story and the unexpected twists that came with it. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting stories, and leave a comment below, letting me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your opinions and any ideas you might have for future videos. And if you think your friends would enjoy this too, feel free to share the video with them. Your support means the world to me, and it helps bring more incredible stories to life. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.